Left with nothing by her husband, she surprises everyone by showing up at her father-in-law's will reading. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. The rain hammered against the windshield as Julia parked her aging sedan across the street from the towering mansion that had once been a second home to her. Her hands trembled as she turned off the engine, the weight of years of betrayal pressing down on her chest. The house, with its grand marble columns and ornate iron gates, loomed like a monument to the life she'd been cruelly cast out of. Julia sat for a moment, staring through the rain-smeared glass, gathering the courage to face the people who had treated her like an outsider. It had been 2 years since Eric left. Julia had married him believing in the promise of forever. Eric was charming, successful, and came from one of the wealthiest families in the city. At first, she thought she'd found her fairy tale, but the reality of life with him soon soured. Eric's charm hid a cold, self-serving nature. He craved status and control, and Julia, a schoolteacher from a modest background, was never enough for him or his family. When Eric announced he was leaving her for another woman, a younger, glamorous socialite, Julia was blindsided. He left her with nothing, forcing her out of their shared home with little more than her clothes and a battered suitcase. She'd later learned that Eric and his family had worked together to ensure she couldn't contest the divorce. She was left humiliated and penniless. Life after Eric was a struggle. Julia moved into a tiny studio apartment and picked up extra teaching jobs to make ends meet. Nights were often spent grading papers at her kitchen table, her stomach empty because she couldn't afford a proper meal. Yet through it all, she refused to break. Eric's betrayal had wounded her, but it had also hardened her resolve. She would survive no matter how difficult the road ahead. Now, sitting in her car outside the Carmichael estate, Julia questioned her decision to come. She had learned of Richard Carmichael's passing only a week ago, through a brief obituary in the newspaper. Eric's father had always been a complicated figure, stern and distant, but never outright cruel to her. They had shared polite conversations at family dinners, and though he never intervened in Eric's treatment of her, she sometimes sensed a flicker of disapproval in his eyes. The invitation to the will reading had come as a shock. Delivered by courier to her tiny apartment, the heavy envelope bore the unmistakable Carmichael family crest. She almost didn't open it, certain it was some cruel mistake. But curiosity won, and now here she was, about to walk into the lion's den. The door to the mansion opened before she could knock, and the butler, an older man with a severe expression, ushered her inside without a word. The house smelled the same: polished wood, expensive cologne, and freshly cut flowers. It was disorienting to be back, a flood of memories threatening to pull her under. She forced herself to focus as the butler led her to the study where the family had gathered. The room fell silent the moment she entered. All eyes turned to her, a mixture of shock, disdain, and curiosity written across their faces. Eric was there, of course, standing near the window with his arm draped casually around his new wife Cassandra. The sight of them together sent a pang of bitterness through Julia's chest, but she quickly buried it. She wouldn't let them see her hurt. "What are you doing here?" Eric's voice was sharp, cutting through the tense silence. He stepped forward, his expression a mask of incredulity. "I was invited," Julia replied calmly, holding up the envelope as proof. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. She refused to let him intimidate her. "You must be mistaken," Cassandra chimed in, her tone dripping with condescension. "This is a private family matter." Before Julia could respond, the lawyer, a composed man with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Carmichael, Julia, is here because she is listed as a beneficiary in Mr. Richard Carmichael's will." The room erupted into chaos. Eric's face turned a deep shade of red as he sputtered protests, while Cassandra looked as though she'd been slapped. The other relatives whispered furiously among themselves, their eyes darting between Julia and the lawyer. Julia stood silently, her head held high, though inside she was just as stunned as they were. "This is ridiculous," Eric shouted, turning to the lawyer. "She has no right, no claim to this family." Your father disagreed, the lawyer said coolly. He opened a thick leather-bound folder and began to read. Before his passing, Mr. Richard Carmichael made several amendments to his will. These changes were made in private, with no influence from any family members. Julia Carmichael is listed as a direct beneficiary. Julia's mind raced as the lawyer's words sank in. She had expected hostility, even mockery, but this? Richard had deliberately included her in his will. Why? The man had barely spoken to her in the years she'd been married to Eric. She struggled to make sense of it as the lawyer continued reading, detailing the distribution of assets. It quickly became clear that Julia's inclusion wasn't a minor detail. Richard had left her something significant, something that Eric and his family clearly believed should have been theirs. The tension in the room grew with every passing minute, until Eric finally snapped. "This is outrageous," he bellowed, slamming his hand on the table. "You can't seriously expect us to accept this." "Mr. Carmichael," the lawyer said firmly, "your father's will is legally binding. If you wish to contest it, you are welcome to do so in court. However, I should warn you that your father was meticulous in his preparations. Any challenge will likely fail." Julia watched as Eric's bravado faltered, his anger giving way to frustration. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of power, a small victory against the man who had taken everything from her. She didn't know why Richard had chosen to include her, but in that moment, she silently thanked him. As the reading continued, the room grew colder, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Julia stayed silent, letting the lawyer's words wash over her. She didn't need to gloat or defend herself. The will spoke for her. By the time the reading concluded, Eric's face was a mask of barely concealed fury, and Cassandra looked ready to faint. The rest of the family avoided Julia's gaze, their whispers fading as they left the room one by one. When it was over, Julia stood alone in the study, her hands trembling as she clutched the copy of the will the lawyer had handed her. Whatever came next, one thing was clear. Her life was about to change forever. Julia stepped out of the mansion, clutching the will like a lifeline. The rain had eased, but the storm inside her raged on. Questions churned in her mind. Why had Richard included her in his will? What had she ever done to deserve his favor? She couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing Eric's outrage, but the mystery of Richard's intentions gnawed at her. She climbed into her car, glancing back at the mansion's towering silhouette. It no longer intimidated her. For years she had been cast out, treated as an outsider by Eric and his family. But today she had stood tall in their midst. Yet beneath her calm exterior, unease simmered. Richard had always been distant. Why would he leave her something significant? The answer, she realized, might lie in the details of the will. She unfolded the papers, scanning the clauses until her eyes landed on the section listing her inheritance. The words made her gasp. To Julia Carmichael, I leave the Carmichael Vineyard estate and all associated assets. Julia's hands trembled. The vineyard was the jewel of the Carmichael Empire, a sprawling property known for producing some of the finest wines in the country. She had visited it only once, during a family holiday years ago. Eric's family had treated her like a servant during that trip, assigning her menial tasks while they lounged in luxury. She never imagined she'd one day own the place. A pang of unease accompanied the realization. This inheritance wasn't just significant, it was monumental. Why would Richard bypass his own son to leave her such a legacy? Determined to find answers, Julia decided to visit the vineyard. The lawyer had given her the keys, along with documents officially transferring ownership. It was hers now, whether she understood why or not. The next morning, Julia drove to the estate, her modest sedan looking woefully out of place on the long tree-lined driveway. The vineyard stretched endlessly on either side, rows of grapevines blanketed in morning mist. At the heart of the property stood a grand house, its stone facade weathered but elegant. Workers moved through the fields, their movements efficient and practiced. As Julia stepped out of the car, a man approached. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent under the sun. His expression was one of cautious curiosity. "You must be Julia," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Henry, the vineyard manager. Mr. Carmichael spoke highly of you." Julia blinked, caught off guard. "He spoke highly of me." Henry nodded. "He didn't share much, but he always mentioned how you were the only one who treated people with kindness, even when you didn't have to. He said you had a good heart, better than most of his family." Julia felt a lump form in her throat. Richard had noticed her. She had always assumed he barely acknowledged her presence. Henry motioned toward the house. "Come inside. There's something you should see." Inside the house, Henry led Julia to a study lined with bookshelves and filled with a faint scent of aged wood and leather. On the desk sat a small stack of letters, each one addressed to her in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. "These arrived shortly before he passed," Henry explained. "He asked me to hold on to them until now." Julia hesitated before picking up the first letter. The paper was thick and expensive, the handwriting elegant but slightly shaky. She unfolded it and began to read. "Dear Julia, if you're reading this, it means I've passed, and you've been dragged back into the chaos of the Carmichael family. For that, I apologize, but I needed to ensure you were taken care of. You're probably wondering why I left the vineyard to you. The truth is, I admired you far more than I ever let on. You were kind, patient, and loyal in ways my son never deserved. When Eric betrayed you, it broke something in me. I saw too much of myself in him, selfish, arrogant, and blind to what truly matters. The vineyard was always meant to be a legacy of integrity and hard work. I couldn't trust Eric to honor that. But you have the strength and character to make it thrive. I hope this gift brings you the stability and peace you deserve. Sincerely, Richard Carmichael." Tears blurred Julia's vision as she set the letter down. Richard's words carried a weight she hadn't expected. He had seen her, truly seen her, even when she felt invisible. The inheritance wasn't just a financial boon. It was a validation of her worth. She read the other letters, each one revealing more of Richard's thoughts. He wrote about his regrets as a father, his disappointment in Eric's choices, and his hope that Julia would find happiness again. By the time she finished, she felt an overwhelming mix of gratitude and sadness. Word of Julia's inheritance spread quickly, and it didn't take long for Eric to show up at the vineyard. He arrived unannounced, striding into the house as if he still owned it. Julia was in the study, sorting through more of Richard's papers, when she heard his voice echoing down the hall. "This is ridiculous, Julia." Eric stormed into the room, his face flushed with anger. "That vineyard belongs to me. My father had no right to." "He had every right," Julia interrupted, her voice calm but firm. She stood, meeting his glare with unwavering resolve. "And he made his wishes perfectly clear. The vineyard is mine." Eric scoffed. "You can't possibly think you can manage a property like this. You're a schoolteacher, for God's sake. Sell it to me and save yourself the trouble." Julia crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "I'm not selling. And if you think you can bully me into changing my mind, you're wasting your time." Eric's expression darkened. "Don't be stupid, Julia. You have no idea what you're doing. This place will fall apart under your watch." "That's not your concern," Julia shot back. "Your father trusted me with this vineyard, and I intend to honor his trust. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Eric opened his mouth to argue, but Julia held up a hand to stop him. "Leave. Or I'll have you escorted off the property." For a moment, Eric looked as though he might explode. But then he turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. As his car roared down the driveway, Julia sank into the chair, her heart pounding. She had stood up to Eric, something she never thought she'd be able to do. And for the first time in years, she felt truly free. Julia stood on the balcony of the vineyard's main house, gazing out over the rolling hills bathed in golden sunlight. The vineyard was alive with activity. workers harvesting grapes, trucks rolling in and out, and the hum of life and progress filling the air. For the first time in years, Julia felt a deep sense of belonging. Richard's letters had given her clarity and purpose, but the real work was only beginning. Managing the vineyard wasn't without its challenges. Julia immersed herself in learning the business, poring over Richard's meticulous records and spending hours in the fields with Henry. The workers, initially skeptical of her leadership, soon warmed to her. She treated them with respect, asking questions and listening to their advice. Slowly but surely, she earned their trust. But Eric wasn't done with her. 2 weeks after his dramatic appearance at the vineyard, Julia received a summons to court. Eric was contesting the will. His arguments were as predictable as they were infuriating. Richard had been manipulated, Julia wasn't capable of managing the vineyard, and the estate rightfully belonged to him. The first court hearing was a circus. Eric arrived with a team of high-priced lawyers, his confidence radiating as if the outcome were already decided. Julia, by contrast, had only one attorney, an older man named Walter whom Richard had recommended in his letters. Walter was calm and methodical, his years of experience evident in every measured word he spoke. Eric's lawyers argued that Richard's amendments to the will were out of character, suggesting that Julia had unduly influenced him. They presented witnesses, distant relatives and former employees, who painted Julia as a gold digger. Julia sat silently through the barrage, her hands clenched in her lap. It was like reliving the worst moments of her marriage, the same accusations and judgments from people who didn't know her. But then Walter rose to speak. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady and commanding, "the plaintiff's case relies entirely on conjecture and character assassination. My client's integrity and the late Mr. Carmichael's intentions are clear, as evidenced by these letters." Walter handed the judge a folder containing Richard's handwritten letters to Julia. As the judge read through them, the courtroom fell silent. The letters were undeniable proof of Richard's clear and deliberate wishes. One by one, the foundation of Eric's case crumbled. In his final argument, Walter delivered a piercing blow. "Mr. Carmichael did not leave this vineyard to my client on a whim. He chose her because she exemplifies the qualities he wanted to preserve in his legacy: kindness, resilience, and integrity. Qualities that, I dare say, are glaringly absent in the plaintiff." Eric's face turned scarlet, his confidence shattered. The judge ruled in Julia's favor, upholding the validity of the will. Eric stormed out of the courtroom, his threats echoing down the hall. But Julia didn't care. She had won. Months passed, and the vineyard flourished under Julia's leadership. With Henry's help, she introduced sustainable farming practices and expanded their distribution network. The vineyard gained recognition for its innovative approaches, and Julia's reputation as a savvy businesswoman grew. One day, as Julia walked through the vineyard, her phone buzzed with an unexpected call. It was a reporter from a prominent magazine, requesting an interview. Word of her victory in court and the vineyard's success had spread, and people were fascinated by her story. Reluctantly, Julia agreed. The interview was published a month later, accompanied by a stunning photo of Julia standing among the grapevines. The headline read, "From Betrayal to Triumph: How One Woman Turned Heartbreak into a Thriving Legacy." The article detailed Julia's journey, from being abandoned by Eric to inheriting the vineyard and transforming it into a success. It also included excerpts from Richard's letters, highlighting the admiration he had for her. The story resonated with readers, drawing attention to Julia's strength and resilience. Eric, of course, was livid. The article painted him as the antagonist, and he became the subject of public ridicule. Cassandra, his new wife, left him shortly after, taking what little remained of his dwindling fortune. Julia couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. One evening, as Julia sat on the porch of the vineyard house, a final envelope caught her eye. It had been tucked inside one of Richard's old journals, unnoticed until now. She opened it with trembling hands. "Dear Julia, if you're reading this, it means you've embraced the vineyard and made it your own. I have no doubt you've faced challenges, but I hope you've also found joy and fulfillment. You deserved better than what my son gave you, and I regret not stepping in sooner. But you've proven something to me. Strength isn't loud or aggressive. It's quiet and steady, like the roots of these vines. I hope this place becomes a sanctuary for you, as it was for me. And remember, Julia, the vineyard's success isn't measured in profits or awards. It's measured in the lives it touches, the workers, the community, and the people who drink its wine. Keep that in your heart always. Sincerely, Richard. Julia wiped away tears as she folded the letter. Richard's words had given her more than an inheritance. They had given her a purpose. She had spent years feeling invisible, dismissed by Eric and his family, but now she stood tall, rooted in the legacy Richard had entrusted to her. Years later, Julia hosted an event at the vineyard, a harvest festival that had become an annual tradition. Families wandered through the fields, sipping wine and enjoying the crisp autumn air. Julia moved through the crowd, greeting guests and basking in the joy that filled the estate. At one point, she paused near the edge of the vineyard, where a plaque had been installed in Richard's honor. It read, "In memory of Richard Carmichael, a legacy of integrity and resilience." Julia smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. The vineyard had become more than a business. It was a testament to the power of kindness, perseverance, and the quiet strength that Richard had seen in her all along. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.